Hello, everyone, and welcome to our midweek live stream. My name is Simon Pastorello, and I am the senior pastor of the Beacon Elim Churches. And this is going to be the second episode of our brand new series entitled Returning to House Churches, a series that is centered on the doctrine and practice of God's original blueprints for His church and what all that means for us today, particularly for our own local reality. As I've mentioned in a previous episode, this season of lockdown has really kind of forced me personally as well, to enter a season of deep reflection upon a number of things, especially with regards to what is church and how is church supposed to operate in a season like this one where buildings have been closed down. How do we continue to exist and operate as a church that is scattered online, that is introduced in people's homes on a regular basis through the aid of technology and so on. And one of the things that we found ourselves reevaluating and appreciating a lot more is all the benefits and advantages of a more scattered expression of church. We really felt like God's been awakening us to the importance of a more scattered dimension of church life, which we are planning to invest in through the implementation of a local network of house churches. There are in fact three key aspects of church life that unfortunately are far more difficult to fully experience and fully appreciate within a larger gathered context. And the one that we're going to be focusing our attention on tonight is something that really identifies or should identify the hallmark of the very Christian identity. But before we actually look at that, let me just start us off with a question. If you were to ask your friends, neighbors, and community to describe Christians in one word, what would that word be? I think we will be receiving all sorts of answers back, all sorts of different words, some more positive than others, I'm sure. But if we had asked this question to Jesus, his answer would be as clear as day, would be very straightforward. And we actually find it in the Gospel of John chapter 13 verse 34 when he said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples." That's the hallmark. If you have love for one another. Now, these words are taken from a very, very significant moment of Jesus' ministry. Jesus was only hours away from being betrayed, unfairly tried, and then condemned and crucified. And so Jesus kind of knew that he only had a very short time before he was taken away from his disciples. And as soon as Judas, the disciple that would go on to betray him, as soon as Judas left their presence to effectively go and sell him out to the religious elite, Jesus didn't waste any time and spoke to the remaining 11 disciples and gave them what was to become the greatest commandment for them to strive towards, for them to fulfill, something that would not only regulate the values and dynamics of the Christian community, but that would determine the hallmark by which they should be known by the wider community, namely to love one another just as Jesus loved them. And the key to this commandment wasn't so much the word love, although that's super important, we're going to see that. in a moment, but more so Jesus' example. The standard that he laid with that commandment, not just to love one another, but to love one another according to his standards and according to his examples, to love one another just as he did. Now, unlike English, the English language, which only has one word for the concept of love, which is the same for every kind of expression of love, whether it be the love for your mother, the love for your wife, or the love for Peter. The Greek language actually has 8 different words describing 8 different expressions of love. There's philautia, that identifies the love of the self, both in a negative and positive way. Positive like self-esteem, and negative like hubris. Mania, that is obsessive love. Philia, the love of friends or friendship, basically. Storge, that is familial love. The love, say, for example, for a father toward his daughter, or a husband to his wife, or I don't know, any other close connection between relatives. Those kinds of relationships and the love between them was described by the word philia. By the word storge. Then ludus, which described uncommitted love, like when you are, I don't know, flirting with a girl or just dating one. And then pragma, that is the pragmatic or practical expression of love, particularly within an arranged marriage, something that is not very common nowadays in the West for sure, but that back then was quite a common practice. And eros, indicating romantic love. But then we have another word, another kind of standard of love described by the word agape, the 8th category of love. Love in its highest and purest form, identified as divine love, as perfect love, and used by Jesus here to pinpoint the kind of love by which his disciples were not only to be loving one another with, but also the kind of love and hallmark by which they were to become famous and known for in the wider community. Now, there are 3 dimensions to agape love that make it so different and so distinct, so separate from all the other types of love, all the other expressions of love. First of all, agape love is selfless. It gives itself without expecting anything in return. Secondly, it's undeserved. That is, it gives itself in the same measure to both foe and friend, to both the ones who would love us back as well as those who would hate us back. And that's why agape, for example, is the word that Jesus used in another commandment to his disciples when he said to them, when he commanded them to love their enemies and to pray for those who persecuted them. Agape love does not have standards of intensity based on the worth of the recipient. Agape love loves everyone the same, irrespective of who they are, irrespective of where they come from, irrespective of the way in which they're related to the one who's commanded to love them with agape love. It is a love that is always full and it is always complete. And thirdly, it's in view of all these, it is a love that it's based on choice rather than feeling. Agape love is based not on feelings but on choice, and it originates not in the heart but it originates in the will. And so, putting these 3 characteristics together, we can define agape love as the constant choice to give oneself for the well-being of others, irrespective of their worth, and expecting nothing in return. But Jesus, when he gave this command to his disciples to love one another just he has loved them, and just as he has loved us, he never really expected them to turn to a dictionary to tell them what that meant. Rather, he pointed them to himself. That's why he didn't just say, I command you to agape love one another, but he said, I command you to agape love one another just as I have agape loved you. You know, he didn't leave their understanding of agape love and how to put it into practice. He didn't leave it up to debate. Okay, he didn't leave the definition open to subjectivity, but he actually made it very clear. You know, you just look at me and just watch, appreciate not just the measure, but the way in which I've loved you, and you make sure that you love one another according to the same standard. And so the agape love of Jesus mentioned by this commandment simply had to be imitated according to Jesus' example. Because, as John would reveal in his first letter, God himself, Jesus himself, is agape love. Jesus doesn't just have agape love, and so he's calling his disciples to kind of imitate something that he has. He called his disciples to look at him in the way they should be loving one another, because he himself is that love. He himself is agape love. He is love himself personified. Hence the way he reworded the Old Testament commandment from love your neighbor as yourself to love one another as I have loved you. In essence, it's not a new commandment, but the way in which Jesus put it, particularly with regards to its high standards and how they have to be fulfilled according to the example that Jesus left his disciples, then it becomes a new commandment. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Now, something that is very significant as well, and the fact that these words are found so prominently in all of John's literature, but both his gospel as well as his 3 epistles, is the fact that John was the one that was closest to Jesus when Jesus spoke these words. In his gospel, he gives us that detail. He was leaning on Jesus's very chest. He could actually feel Jesus's heartbeat while Jesus gave this command to love one another as he has loved us. And it's of no surprise that God's love, the love of Christ, and how it should be replicated in our relationship with one another, has such prominence in his literature. And in 1 John, in his first letter, in his first epistle, chapter 4, verses 7 to 11, he writes this: Beloved, let us love one another. And again, every time he mentions the word love here, it's actually agape love, okay? The perfect love of God. Beloved, let us agape love one another. For agape love is from God. And whoever agape loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not agape love does not know God, because God is agape love. And in this, the agape love of God was made manifest among us. That is, in this way, the love of God has been manifested to us. That God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love. Again, in this is agape love. Not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, again, if God so agape loved us, we also ought to agape love one another. So in this passage, not only, again, John reinstates what Jesus said on that first occasion after the first communion, after the Last Supper, but he also went on to say that, yes, to love one another with that agape love as modeled in Jesus. Not only is it the hallmark of the Christian identity, but it's also the sign of knowing God himself. If we call ourselves Christians, but we do not agape love one another, not only we're just fooling ourselves, but rightly so, we should be identified as hypocrites, because we cannot claim to know God and not love one another, since God is agape love made flesh in Jesus. Hence the necessity for the Christian community to be committed to learning how to agape love one another through the example set by Jesus in the Gospels. And this is exactly what the Apostle Paul was referring to when he wrote this, when in one of his letters, I think it was the letter to the Ephesians, he said that his regular prayer for his church was that they may have strength to comprehend with all the saints, that is, with all the other disciples, what is the breadth, the length, and the height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. What the Apostle Paul was saying there was that the love of God, which is God himself, is so beyond our comprehension, so great, so high, so wide, so deep, so, it's immeasurable, and the whole of eternity wouldn't be sufficient for us to fully measure it up and fully appreciate it. Nonetheless, we are called to explore it. We are called to dive in it. We are called to delve in it together as a community, learning this love more and more, and not just learning it academically, but learning it practically, by putting it in practice, by expressing it toward one another. And the more we explore it and put it into practice, the more we will be filled with the fullness of God, because God is agape love. Isn't that a really, really deep thought, and a really deeply challenging one for our relationships with one another? And so, with the introduction of a network of house churches, we are resolved to see a restoration of commitment to Christ-like love. The first of three tenets at the heart of such expression of scattered church. Not that this kind of love is completely absent from the church in a more gathered way, far from it. In fact, if anything, we have noticed during this time of lockdown, agape love really being activated in so many of us, as we supported one another, as we encouraged one another, as we looked after one another, as we helped provide for one another, and not just within our Christian circles, but outside of our Christian circles. That's been phenomenal. But the reason why it's been so evident during this season is because this season forced us to scatter. And that's where we realized how the many disadvantages of being exclusively a gathered reality as a church. Not that we want to stop being that kind of church, not that we want to stop kind of expressing church life in a gathered way. We're going to continue to do that because there's many advantages to that. But there is an aspect of church life, particularly the three tenets, of which the first one, the one we're talking about tonight, Christ-like love, this expression of agape love toward one another according to Jesus' model. This reality, as well as two more that we're going to be looking at in the next two episodes, they do not find as easy an expression in a larger gathering, in a larger context. Somehow they are harder to achieve in such a context. So let me just give you a few examples that probably will help you kind of will help me clarify what I'm trying to say. Agape love, being such a wonderful and amazing, such a big love, such a great love, finds expressions in so many different ways, such as companionship and fellowship, acceptance and welcome, support and care, service, and the list could go on and on and on and on. Now, all these expressions can be easily dodged, in a sense, or avoided, or not fully experienced in a larger gathered reality. Take, for example, companionship or fellowship. This sense of belonging to a reality bigger than ourselves, a sense of oneness and togetherness, of commonality, of purpose, cannot be effectively achieved with just 1.5 hours together one day a week on a Sunday morning. Are you with me? I'm sure you understand what I mean by that. Because that is not doing life together. That doesn't offer us a big enough platform to experience and communicate the agape love that is modeled in Jesus to one another. In a larger context, fellowship sometimes even needs and must be arranged in order for it to happen. I remember people coming to me and saying, when are we going to have, the next fellowship meal at church? People that were really longing for fellowship, that were really longing for companionship and for an expression of agape love in that way. And it always kind of made me smile and made me a bit sad at the same time, to think that we had to arrange for something like this to happen. When we read of it in Scripture, it just should happen naturally. We read in the first couple of chapters in the book of Acts that the original church, the original disciples, they were committed to a number of things, and very high on that list of priorities was fellowship. We read that they were committed to fellowship. The apostles never had to arrange anything to for them to enjoy fellowship, for them to experience fellowship. It just happened naturally. Why? Because they were gathering regularly in people's houses. They were doing life together rather than just meeting in the temple for 1 hour, an hour and a half, only one day a week. Because their context was far more scattered than ours is, fellowship and companionship, that, oneness and that togetherness was experienced far more easily and far more naturally. But what about also things such as acceptance and welcome? Again, in a larger context, we tend to gravitate around the people that we know, friends of ours, people that we feel, we have more in common with at a natural level or at a cultural level. And there's nothing unnatural about it, and there is nothing wrong about it. It's just the way it is. We're just, that's our social makeup, and that's exactly how we end up behaving. But in a larger context, a new face would be easily missed. Why? Because we are surrounded by our friends and our relatives, and we're surrounded by the ones that we're normally associating ourselves with. And so we miss much more easily the ones that may be coming in for the first time. And that's why, for example, most churches would have a welcome team. As if welcoming wasn't something that belonged to everyone, a responsibility and a pleasure really that belonged to everyone. But again, these sort of things become much harder in a larger context. And we don't have a welcome team at our church. Our church is particularly welcoming, but we're not as big as other churches either. And so we don't have that kind of issue. But we've noticed that very often, a new face would go unnoticed by a number of people, and we didn't feel that was particularly right. So we put measures and systems in place to identify these people and to welcome them to the fellowship, and for the fellowship to welcome them, from giving out, welcome bags, to encouraging people for 30 seconds after the announcement to turn to the person next to them or behind them or in front of them, someone they've not seen before, and just saying hi and welcoming them to the church. But that's not the kind of expression of agape love that God wants us to express, that Jesus commanded us to express. In the area of support and care, again, in a larger context, we can easily miss the signs of a struggling or grieving soul. Again, because very often the larger the context is, the more individual faces can get kind of lost in the crowd. I remember I was born and raised. I'm speaking from experiences. I was born and raised in a fairly large church. It was the largest Pentecostal church in Milan, 500 strong people. But we were fully integrated. My parents were very, very active in the church, and when I became a Christian, I became very, very active in the church. The people that I was rubbing shoulders with, we were all born the same year. We grew up together from the cradle up. We quite literally, our parents were friends with each other, and so very, very strong relationships, very active across church, and knowing, I felt I knew everyone. And then I remember one day we were in church, and I see this guy. Their face wasn't new. Was completely new to me. And for those of you who know me, I'm really bad with names, but faces, I'm incredible. I've got a photographic memory, and it has happened in the past while here in Blackburn that I would recognize a face that had only showed up, that the last time that it showed up was like 4 years prior. So I am that good with remembering faces. And that face I'd not seen. And so I went over to that person and I introduced myself. I welcomed them to the church. And I asked them, if that was their first time coming to our church. And he turned around and he said, "What are you talking about, Simon? I've been coming to this church for 30 years. I know you, I know your parents." And I was blown away. The fact that even though I was born and bred in that church, even though I thought I knew everyone, there were still people that I just did not know, to the extent that I'd never seen that guy. And so, yeah, that in a larger context, so much easier to miss new faces, so much easier to miss the ones that are struggling, the ones that are grieving, the ones that would not come to you with a cry for help, but that are nonetheless in desperate need. And again, in a larger context, there is always the assumption that the pastor will be looking after individuals and that somebody else will be kind of dealing with this sort of things, when really Christ has called us to agape love one another, to continuously choose to lay our lives down for the well-being of those next to us. If we read the scriptures, we'd come across a picture of the church that sees it as a body where each member is connected to another, where there isn't one person that knows everyone, but where everyone is known and where everyone is cared for, because everyone cares for one another, everyone supports one another, everyone loves one another, just as Jesus has loved us. And the same again I could tell about service, serving God, serving one another, very often in a larger context, if something needs doing, the assumption at the back of the mind of many people, not that there is anything evil or wrong about them, but very often the assumption is, well, I'm sure somebody else is going to sort it out, because there's so many of us in here. And that one thing very often doesn't get done and until someone who's particularly servant-hearted comes in, sees it and sorts it out. But again, all these things in a smaller scattered context, such as a house church, they become almost unavoidable. If a new face comes into a group of 5 or 10 at the most, everybody will notice that person. If someone comes in with a downcast outlook or a sense of burden or a sense of grief and whatever, everybody will notice. Everybody will be in a position saying, hey, what's up, mate? Everybody will be in a position of minister to that person and again manifest that agape love to one another and so on. If an opportunity for service arises in a group of 5 or up to 10 people, that reality becomes unavoidable. Okay, that needs doing. Let's get it sorted. Let's serve Christ in this particular case. So in other words, whereas we can dodge these realities, whereas we can dodge various expressions of that agape love which Christ calls us to, in a smaller context, that is not so easy. A smaller context challenges us in a very real and unavoidable way to love one another as Christ has loved us. So with house churches, we want to create an environment where Christ-like agape love is not only expressed and experienced quite naturally by all those in the room, but also missionally as well. We want to create smaller communities of disciples where the love of Christ is so real and tangible as to become irresistible to those who are desperate for it, giving us the opportunity to point them to the source of such love, which is Jesus himself. Again, let me take you back to Jesus' words when he said, love one another as I have loved you. By your love for one another, by this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. Quite recently, I was reading an article on the psychology of gang violence and gangs in general. And very often at the root of the strength of the phenomenon that is gangs is a desperate need for companionship, desperate need to belong to a reality that is bigger than ourselves, desperate need to be part of a group, of a community of people that are united, that protect one another, that watch one another's backs, that provides for one another, that support one another, that would even go to the extent of dying for one another and killing for one another. Often on the news we hear about gang violence, especially in big cities like London. Well, let me tell you, we've got the answer. If that is at the root of much of the social issues that we are facing today, well, the church is once again the answer. And Jesus' command is more relevant today than it has ever been. Especially putting even aside gang violence for a moment and all of that psychology and all of that brokenness. But come on, something that is becoming so predominant, an issue that is becoming so predominant nowadays across the West is social isolation. Forget about the COVID. Social isolation existed already. So many people that live their lives in complete isolation, not because they want to, but because the world and society we've created is a lot more individualistic and a lot more isolated. Again, the church is the answer. And so we want to create an environment where people can experience the fullness of the agape love of Christ. growing as a church and becoming a larger gathered reality. It just isn't cutting it with regards to this very important aspect of church life, because someone can come in and be invisible. Someone can come in and be undetected by the majority, and that is certainly not what Christ wants for his people and for his church. So yes, here we have it, the first tenet of the upcoming network of house churches, that is Christ-like love, to be committed together to Christ-like agape love, learning, pursuing and replicating the love with which Jesus has loved us, making it available to anyone that is desperate for it, so pointing them to the source of such a great love, which is Jesus himself, and the way in which he has loved us by dying the death of the cross. And so, yes, let us consider this. Let us begin to ponder deeply upon this reality, and the way in which our God calls us to love one another as he has loved us. In the video description, I have left a link that you can click if you're interested in this project, if you're interested in becoming part of this network of local house churches. Again, the project is still a work in progress, okay? We're still identifying areas where we want to have a house church. We're still identifying who can be hosting them and who can be leading them. But we are certainly very keen on making sure that all of these things are ready in time for the end of this lockdown. And so if you're interested in taking part, either as a member, or maybe you want to host, or maybe you want to lead one of these house churches, whichever way you want to be involved, whichever way you want to take part in it, just click on that link and just sign up. Don't worry, there's no obligation. We just want to gauge how many of us will be interested in something like this, in being part of something like this. Obviously, our desire is for all of our members to be connected in such a way. But if you're particularly keen, just click on that link, fill it in with your details, and that will somehow earmark you before us as someone who would want to be involved, and we will certainly keep you updated with progress, and we will certainly bear you in mind as we build up this network. Until then, the Lord bless you and have a fantastic rest of the evening. Bye-bye.